Welcome to episode 320 of the Defensive Security Podcast. My name is Jerry Bell, and not joining me today, as always, is Mr. Andrew Callett, who is unfortunately serving time in a cyber detention facility, or at least that's what I'm to understand is going on. So we've kicked the can down the road long enough, so I'm going to go solo for this episode, and hopefully Mr. Callett joins us again next week. So you're stuck with me today. Before we get started, there's a couple things I wanted to say. First, continued thank you to all of our Patreon sponsors. I sincerely appreciate you in supporting us in our mission here. Also, if you would like to be a Patreon sponsor, you can do so by visiting our Patreon site. It's patreon.com/defensivesec, DEFENSIVESEC. Thank you so much. Next, the thoughts and opinions that I will express are mine and not those of my past, present, or future employers. Don't have one at present, but you get the point. The next thing I wanted to talk about a bit is something a little bit orthogonal to the news or any of the topics that I'm going to cover today, but I thought it was really important to discuss because there's a very, very concerning trend right now. I was going to call it a pandemic or an epidemic, but it's a little tacky post-COVID. But if you're not aware, I suspect most of you are aware, there is just an absolute dearth of hacks happening right now involving Salesforce organizations. And it's not Salesforce itself that's getting hacked, just to be very clear. It's Salesforce customer accounts getting hacked. And it's getting to the point now where, I think it's worth having a special call out and a quick side discussion about this. From what I've observed, and there's been quite a lot of recent hacks in the news, the likes of Google, and I think TransUnion just announced that they got hacked, and whole bunches of others. So the way these hacks are happening is through primarily three methods. First is tricking employees of an organization to connecting some sort of a rogue app connection. And this can be either a legitimate data loader from Salesforce, or in some campaigns, it's been actually some custom tooling that actors have created. But nevertheless, the way that it is initiated is the same. The bad actor tricks some authorized employee into connecting their application. And quite often they're doing that by impersonating IT or a vendor or something like that that needs that connection for some legitimate purpose. And they're just relying on normal social engineering tactics to trick the victim. The next tactic that we're seeing is by the actors finding exposed credentials in code. So we're seeing these threat actors just ransacking open GitHub repositories, packaged applications on smart devices, and many other things to extract authentication keys that allow them to get access either to Salesforce directly or to other systems that might contain those keys. So things like build systems or database servers or whatnot. And then the third thing that we've been seeing is compromised third parties. And that's where often you'll see a company engage perhaps a software as a service vendor that has some kind of connection into their Salesforce tenant. And that connection requires the SaaS provider to have some kind of an entitlement to connect. So those are the three main avenues that we're seeing right now. And I should also say, this is not necessarily a uniquely Salesforce problem. Salesforce is certainly at the center of the storm right now, but I don't think we should assume that that's going to be the case going forward. I'm sure there'll be more more Salesforce fun to come. But I'm guessing that that we're going to see this branch out, and to some extent, that this is a similar flavor to what happened with Microsoft back a couple of years ago. Lesser extent, the Snowflake breach, which was, I think, mainly password stuffing, but the end result is the same. The bad actors here, at least in this campaign, seem to be going after additional credentials that might be sitting in the data stored in those tenants. And the purpose, their apparent purpose, is to collect those so they can then move laterally into other organizations. I don't know what the end game is. Like, I don't know if they're ultimately trying to find access to some specific organization, and they're just going to crawl the world until they land in the right Salesforce tenant that has the right access, and then they're done. But it's not largely not been a traditional kind of ransomware attack. There has been some recent shenanigans with the threat actor trying to extort Google into firing some of their Google threat actor or threat intelligence employees, or they'll release the data that they stole. But so far as I know, they're not offering the data for sale. They're really focusing on, this is based on my understanding, the queries that the threat actors are running inside the Salesforce tenants. They're really looking for credentials and whatnot. So again, I think this is right now a Salesforce thing, but it's going to expand out. Where it goes next, I don't really know. I think, as we've talked about many times in the past, we should also assume that this is not going to stay focused to this particular threat actor. There's got to be other actors taking note of the apparent success of this attack, and we should assume that we're going to see others jumping into the fray and using this tactic against Salesforce tenants themselves or other types of SaaS properties, and they'll probably have different motivations and different different intentions for when they get in. So I've been thinking about what can you do. In large measure, this is difficult to provide generic guidance because there's so many details that are specific to different organizations. But I was thinking that you could kind of distill it out into three different things. One is to reduce what I'll call the surface area, right? So a lot of these, again, are happening as a result of employees getting phished. So that speaks to training. It speaks to making sure that you have the proper kind of least privilege in place. If somebody's not authorized to grant that access, they can't do it. And so that's important. By the way, I'm not super familiar with Salesforce. They're the back end of Salesforce, at least. But to the extent that the SaaS provider that you're using allows for additional types of security precautions on accesses from your accounts using things like IP and location restrictions, those would be advisable to implement as well. And I think it goes without saying, you shouldn't be dropping your secrets in code that gets published publicly. And this is one of those things that I've personally seen somewhat frequently. A lot of code never is intended to get published publicly. And so sometimes the thinking is we don't need to focus so much on that particular thing because this code is internal only. The only people who have access to the code would also have access to the credentials, and therefore it's kind of a low risk thing. But in my experience, it happens with unfortunate frequency that code, for a variety of reasons, the people who initiated that kind of decision making leave the organization or what have you, but that code eventually often ends up in some kind of public GitHub repository, and people don't realize what they've done, or they don't realize that they're using a public repo instead of a private repo, etc. So it's just bad form all the way around. There's much better ways of handling that. Along with that, the second recommendation I had was to make sure that you're rotating those secrets and keys, passwords, etc., on a periodic basis. That really helps reduce the window of exposure if those keys somehow do get exposed for, however, right? They're stolen through some open GitHub repository, or they're extracted out of an application, or somebody breaks into somebody's email inbox, or one of the objectives of the Salesforce attack is to extract keys out of clear free text fields on like support tickets and whatnot. So if your keys are there because one of your employees was working with a support team, that could ultimately be stolen without your awareness. And so if you rotate those on a periodic basis, that'll help mitigate. It's not a perfect solution. The other thing, and I would say this is at least as important, and that is just the ability to rotate them is super important. I've seen so often that organizations build systems without the ability to rotate those credentials, or at least without some kind of a heroic effort. And the challenge there is it creates this really difficult situation in the aftermath of an attack. I mean, let's just contemplate a hypothetical where your organization is a customer of Salesforce and you are made aware that one of your vendors was compromised and you believe there might be some keys in there. If your environment and applications aren't set up so that you can rotate keys easily, you may have to go through a pretty painful process and kind of risk decision making around, do I potentially break the application? Do I have to wait till a change window, et cetera? Whereas if you kind of bake this into the process, it makes it just a lot easier. That's been my experience. And then finally is about vendors. Vendor management is hard. I would say we've historically seen people relying on the miracles of vendor management spreadsheets and SOC 2 reports. And you know what? I've been on both sides of those things. And I think anybody who's been around the block can say, like, this is just not a objective determination of whether the third party you're using is actually secure. It kind of demonstrates whether they are able to answer a spreadsheet and whether or not they can convince the auditor that they've met a certain set of controls. And that's kind of orthogonal to whether or not they're actually secure. But it's often the only thing we have to go on. And in the unfortunate situation where you are compromised and you have to you have to defend yourself in court, having a program in place that contemplates those things is better than nothing. So all that to say, like, I don't have the magic answer. I mean, there's lots of little bites at the apple. There's the bit sites and whatnot that will give you a security scorecard. That'll give you some kind of an assessment of your third party. But again, we've talked endlessly about how that's often not super informative about, in particular, software as a service providers, because a lot of times there's some kind of shared responsibility in there. And, a lot of times the bad hygiene is actually the responsibility of other customers of that provider. But what I'm really trying to raise here is the awareness of how urgent the situation seems to be becoming. When I was a CISO so long ago, my observation was that we make business risk decisions with imperfect information. That's not terribly surprising. But where I'm going is when we decide how important an application is, like, let's say, like our Salesforce tenant, we'll often make like really cursory statements about the kinds of data that's in there. It's like business contact information for our customers. It's not, it's not super sensitive, but oftentimes when you when you have the great pleasure of being hacked, you find out that, well, it has that, plus it has whatever other information your customers fed into the ticket system, which could be keys, or it could be PHI, or it could be, other kinds of personal information. And so it's important to think about it along those lines. And then also along the lines of, like, do you have, do you have a large number of banks as customers, as an example? And if your environment were to get hacked and all of the same kinds of information were to be disclosed about all of your customers at the same time, like, does that create any emergent risk that doesn't seem obvious at first? So those are the kinds of things that I think need to be baked into the calculus when you're figuring out how to turn the dial on your level of concern and investment and whatnot around these sorts of environments. So hopefully that makes sense. And with that, we'll move into some stories. And the first one today comes from Security Affairs. And the title here is, After SharePoint Attacks, Microsoft Stops Sharing Proof of Concept Exploit Code with China. So we talked, a month or two ago about how there was this kind of gnarly SharePoint vulnerability that was fixed, but prior to the patch being released, it was under active exploitation. And there was a strong suspicion that it was actually Microsoft's Active Protections Program, or MAP, that was the avenue by which the bad actors got access to the code that was used to perpetrate the attack. And I don't think that there's like a definitive assertion that they definitely know that it was China, but the story here is that in the aftermath of that debacle, Microsoft has decided to cease providing proof of concept code to MAP members who reside in China. And instead, they're just going to provide some kind of high level description of the vulnerability. Now, there is some uniqueness about China. China has, as I understand it, and this is my layman's understanding of some of the legal nuances in China, there is a requirement in China for organizations to provide detailed information about security vulnerabilities in software that the private sector is aware of to the government. So it's possible, definitely not saying that it happened, it's possible that some of those Chinese companies felt obligated or were obligated to provide that proof of concept code to the Chinese government. There's lots of potential ways that could have happened, if that is in fact what happened. But regardless, Microsoft has made the call that they're no longer going to provide a POC code to Chinese firms. So it will be interesting to see if that actually stems the tide. Are we going to continue seeing Microsoft cutting off different countries? Like, are they going to cut off South Korea or the US? Like, who knows, right? That's what I don't really understand, is where this logically ends, because there's a lot of opportunity for bad actors, and they're placing a huge amount of trust in the people who are receiving this proof of concept code. But they do have legal agreements. I'm not saying that they're not taking the right kinds of legal precautions, but that's different than actually preventing someone from using it. So something to keep an eye on as we go forward. Our next story comes from Cybersecurity Dive. The title here is, Developers Knowingly Push Vulnerable Code Despite Growing Breach Risk. The subheadline is, only 3 in 10 respondents said their application security programs were highly mature. So There's a couple of key data points in this article, which is based on a report from Checkmarx. Sorry, it's a security company, and so that says we got to take this with a grain of salt because it's a piece of marketing material, but it is also information that is interesting to us and may be able to help our causes. So the first data point is that nearly 8 in 10 firms report experiencing a breach from vulnerable code in their own applications in 2023. That rose to 90% in 2024 and is at 98% this year. I am a little skeptical about the number 98%. 98% of respondents saying that they have had a breach in 2025 seems weird, but maybe that's the case. Then they go on to say that 8 in 10 companies, or 80%, say that they sometimes or often release software with code they know is vulnerable, which is an increase from 66% in 2024, and that really isn't an oversight. It's kind of a strategy. And, I can't dispute that. We, as organizations, are in the business of producing software that's of value to our customers. Security is not, security is expected. It's a baseline expectation. It's not a feature. And so the thing that tends to get all the attention from a development perspective are the features, the things that either move the needle in terms of efficiency or in terms of garnering new revenue or protecting customer renewals and that sort of thing. So I don't think it should be incredibly surprising. And honestly, I think a lot of this comes down to leadership. This is the job of the security leadership to impart upon the organization how important it is to ensure that there's the right focus on releasing code that is secure. I've honestly lost track because there's been so many changes in government policy as of late. But as late as last year, there were some policies in place that were going to start requiring companies to attest to their development practices. And one of those would be, not publishing or releasing applications that have critical vulnerabilities. Again, I don't know where that's at, and maybe it's been repealed or what, but that is the kind of thing that's going to drive us forward, because otherwise we're kind of left on individual organizations doing the right thing, and as we know, that doesn't always happen. So this really comes down to risk management. Companies are going to have needs to release code that has vulnerabilities from time to time. There's just going to be circumstances. It's unreasonable to say that it can never happen, but it should never happen in a way that creates some sort of really undue exposure. Because most of the time, it's not just our own systems and data that's at risk. It's also our customers. And we end up making implicit decisions on their behalf when we publish code that has vulnerabilities in a way that benefits us, but puts them at risk. So they're not at the table to help make that decision. And they may make a different decision if they were. So, point is, and this is something that I suspect a lot of security managers and engineers can relate to. When I was in the business so long ago, my approach to this was ensuring that we had a robust release management program where everybody understood what the expectation was. There were escape valves, there were processes in place to not only help make sure that the code that we were producing wasn't vulnerable, but also that if there were a situation where we had to release something that was vulnerable, that there was the right kinds of assessment and then mitigating controls in place to address whatever vulnerabilities were there, and making sure that the business understood what they were taking on, and not just like kind of sweeping it under the rug and quietly publishing vulnerable code out to production. And that's sometimes an expensive proposition, right? The benefit of having a very competent red team who was very active in assessing the code that we were releasing, and we had lots of technology and tools to assist. So, but not everybody has that. So, I think this is going to get perhaps worse, especially as we start moving more into AI assisted coding. And in some ways, I think it's going to be because we're just not necessarily aware of either the vulnerabilities that we're releasing or the severity of the vulnerabilities, because we're naturally going to see a downward trend in capabilities of developers as the capabilities of the technology to produce the code increases. It's just the way it's going to work. So something to keep an eye on. The next story comes from securityinfowatch.com, and the title here is "Even Security Leaders Are Breaking AI Rules." So this is another report that comes from Calypso AI. This report, they interviewed or surveyed roughly 1,000 office workers back in June, and they found that 42% of security leaders and security professionals admit that they would use AI in violation of their company policy if it made their work easier. About half have already submitted proprietary company information to AI systems in order to complete a task. Just about 60% of the security decision makers say that they trust AI more than their human colleagues, and 1/3 report feeling no guilt about breaking AI rules. So this is the old adage of the rules are for thee, not for me. So we talk in the industry a lot about security culture, right? They're failable, but they are kind of the first line of defense. But when you have a situation where even the security leaders are not abiding by the very policies that they have established, what does that say about your culture? How good of a security culture can you expect to have? I don't think a good one. It's my take. 16% of these leaders say that their IT team would be unable to detect a leak that would be caused by AI. Terribly surprising. 48% say that their company's AI policy is unclear, and that gives them latitude to decide for themselves how and when to use the technology. I come back to these are the security leaders, right? If the AI policy is not clear enough, it is, in my estimation, a professional responsibility to go and help drive that clarity, not to kind of run around the playground with scissors like all the other kids, to quote something from a friend of mine. So moving on, the overall 42% of all employees are willing to break a policy. So it's a little bit more than the security people. 28% admit to using AI to access sensitive data or documents. Half of respondents would trust AI more than their coworkers. And 1/3 would rather have AI as their manager. This is kind of stunning. So, maybe I don't know what to say. Maybe 40% of people have super bad managers, and therefore it just seems like AI would be a better choice. Then they say that half of C-level executives they surveyed would prefer an AI manager over a human, and 28% of those have submitted proprietary company information to AI. And then they go on to say that 38% admit they don't even know what an AI agent is. So they're leveraging AI, they're trusting AI, but they don't really have a decent handle on what it is. And that tells me that their decision making, their risk decision making, is probably not super competent or reliable. But at the end of the day, like it is their company. However, like a lawyer, they've employed us to help them understand what the risks are, and if we don't explain it to them, it's difficult for them to to see that on commercials they see on CNBC, right? They're gonna only see the good stuff, not the dangerous stuff. Not that we should be wallpapering the office in FUD, but I think we have to do a better job of communicating the risks. At least that's what this report says to me. And by the way, like it's hard to do that if we ourselves are part of the problem. All right, moving on to the next story. This one comes from Dark Reading, and the title here is "Insurers May Limit Payments in Case of Unpatched CVEs." So just like it sounds, there is a movement in the cyber insurance world called CVE exclusions, where if your organization has a policy that is with a carrier that has these CVE exclusions and you suffer a breach while you have an unpatched in one of these CVEs, you are not going to get either the payout or the full payout. It's going to depend on the policy. What I found most interesting about this particular article is that it was a blog post by a US-based insurance underwriter arguing kind of vociferously against the practice. And they actually interview several other people that are in similar roles with US-based insurance carriers. And so I would have expected that the insurance world would kind of be behind this. If your customers aren't doing the right things, then can you reasonably expect your insurance carrier to pick up the slack because you didn't feel like applying a patch? At least that was what was in my mind when I was reading this story. But that's not the case. There's apparently a strong feeling that this is not a good thing in the insurance world. So interesting, but I think it's also worth understanding that insurance companies are in the business of collecting as much in premiums as they can while paying out as little in claims as they can, and so this ultimately is probably something that's going to come to an insurance carrier close to you. I was trying to draw some parallels to other things in the world, like car insurance. If your car, for example, is stolen because you left the doors unlocked or you left the keys in place in the car, would your insurance still pay out? And the answer is a yes. Yes. It's also very nuanced, because if you leave stuff in your car and that stuff gets stolen out of your car, it doesn't actually matter whether your car was locked or not, because your car insurance won't actually cover it. It is typically your homeowner's or renter's insurance that would cover that. Now, I think that insurance is generally, in the US at least, governed on a state-by-state basis. So I'm sure there are going to be some differences in how that works across different states, but that is something interesting. So if you think about it through that lens, it's maybe not so, the position of these insurance people are not so controversial. It aligns with other aspects of insurance. There's a lot of good stuff in this, and I think one of the net points in the article is that insurance companies are becoming less of a kind of an adversarial relationship with their policyholders, and more of a partner where they're trying to uplift the their customers rather than shaming them. And so to me, that says that we're very likely going to see some sort of equivalent to the, I don't know what they're called, but in the US here, at least, a lot of times you can get a significant discount on your car insurance if you plug in a little radio enabled transmitter into your OBD port on your car, which would track how fast you drive, how fast you stop and accelerate, and whether you're speeding, et cetera, et cetera. My guess is that we're going to see similar sorts of concepts happening in the insurance world, where insurance companies will need to have some sort of insight into how your security program is functioning in order for you to get the best rates. It's kind of sensible if you think about it from their perspective. I guess one of the things I struggle with personally, I suppose, they're just kind of bleeding out here, is the notion that we would not do something we know that we should do because we feel secure in the fact that we have insurance. It's kind of like, I'm leaving the house and I'm not so worried about leaving my curling iron plugged in because I have homeowners insurance that will cover the loss if my house burns down. And I think that risk calculus actually does happen more often than we want to admit. And it feels wrong to me. I'm just going to say it that way. It feels wrong to me. On the other hand, where is the line between ignorance and malpractice? And by that, I mean, like, where is the line between not applying a patch to something because you didn't want to do it, or you didn't feel like doing it, versus you weren't aware that you needed to. And so that's, I think, a problematic distinction as well. It's intuitively obvious, but I think from the perspective of some kind of objective adjudication of paying out or not paying out, it's a really, really a hard thing. Anyway, it seems to me like there's a big possibility that we're likely to see some changes in how cybersecurity works, and quite likely we'll see some instance of this exclusion policy, or this CVE exclusion policy, put in place in the U.S. Just my gut feeling, and be prepared for that. The last story for today comes from Dark Reading, and the title here is "Fake Employees Pose Real Security Risks." We've talked a ton about this particular threat. There's a lot of activity coming out of North Korea right now, where they are being quite effective at getting people hired to work fully remote jobs, partnering with what are lovingly called laptop farms here in the U.S. The U.S. Justice Department has been, chasing these things down and trying to play whack-a-mole, but it's a pretty tough game. The point of the article here is, at best, you're likely to lose some amount of money that you pay in salary to these fake employees, but you're also putting yourself at risk, because a lot of times these people are not eligible to work for U.S. companies, and therefore, you potentially exposing yourself to legal problems. And then also, we're increasingly seeing innovation in what these employees are doing once they're inside. So we've seen, for example, instances where these fake employees have stolen cryptocurrency. I think there's a lot of these fake employees have been focused on getting hired at crypto-based firms so that they can steal crypto. We have seen some intellectual property theft, and we'll probably see additional sorts of innovation. So it's not not hard to think that this tactic is becoming refined to the point where we're likely to see threat getting their employees hired as employees at U.S. companies solely to do things like deploy ransomware and whatnot. So, I think we're going to see some additional innovation beyond where we're at. There's I don't think it's referenced in this article, but there's some expectation that as time goes on, the majority of candidates that we see interviewing or applying for at least positions that open positions in an organization are not going to be real people. They're going to be fake personas, and we really have to get ahead of that. I neglected to mention at the start, we had a live episode a couple weeks ago at a security conference. And by the way, we're still waiting for the files to be delivered so that I can post that. That'll be episode 319. So this is going to be kind of super awkward because 319 will come after 320, but nothing else in the world makes sense right now either. So this is just fine. But in that discussion, someone brought up a really clever technique they use when they're interviewing candidates remotely. They ask the candidate to point their webcam at a wall outlet, and that will tell you what country they're in, give or take. The U.S. has somewhat of a unique outlet configuration compared to the rest of the world, and so it's pretty obvious if it's something that's from the U.S. or not. That said, I don't think that's a huge barrier, and my guess is that we're going to see some additional innovations, like where we have specialist people who are perhaps in the country actually conducting the interviews on behalf of the bad actors. So it's not impossible to think that, let's just hypothetically say, North bribe me into interviewing as one of them. And that could be like I wear a wig and a fake mustache or through some deep fake technology and land the job. And then it is somebody from, that ends my involvement in it. And then somebody from the North Korean government takes over the responsibility of executing that job. So there's lots of ways this is likely to unfold. And the reason I bring it up is that I think we have to get ahead of this as an organization and figure out how we're going to defend against this. And I don't know that it's exceptionally complicated. Like, it could be as simple as requiring a face-to-face meeting prior to making an offer. And yeah, that requires travel. And, if somebody's unwilling to travel, then perhaps that's a good indication that they're not who they say they are. I think we're probably also going to see some additional kinds of services. Like, I don't know if this exists, but I can imagine a future where we have, like, the concept of exam proctors. There's regional testing facilities that have like certified proctors where you can go and take, a variety of different kinds of exams, and it is, overseen by a proctor. And it's not hard to think that we might see a similar kind of thing where, there are, geographically dispersed people who run a service where they will attest to having met face to face with somebody before you make an offer or before you onboard them. So anyway, there's lots of things that you can do. Another one I saw, I think this one came up in the discussion also, was, I think actually Andy brought this up, was asking the person to put their hand in front of their face and move their fingers, because a lot of times the deep fake technology right now can't handle that very well. And that, I think, is like a point in time thing. It works today, but probably won't work forever. So, point is, it would be good to start building a program today that can be improved upon in the future. And I also say, by the way, my son recently got a job as a economist at a SaaS company, and they have training. They're largely a remote company, remote workforce, and they deliver training to their employees, all of their employees, on how to identify or spotting the signs that your coworkers might actually be not who they say they are. And I thought that was kind of innovative and forward looking. So I don't know how common that is in the industry right now, but that's an example of a step that you can take as well. So anyway, I hope this was interesting. I apologize for you having to listen to me drone on for I don't know, what was this, an hour or so. And I look forward to having Mr. Caleb back. It was a little difficult talking by myself for so long. So in any event, I certainly appreciate all of you. Thank you again to our Patreon donors. You are awesome. Reminder that we do have a DefSec merch store up and available. My wife is particularly proud of the coffee mug, by the way, hint, hint. It's at store.defensivesecurity.org. Just let me know if you have any issues with that. And with that, I should tell you where to find us, right? You can find links to the stories I described here on our website at defensivesecurity.org. You can follow me on Mastodon. I'm pretty much only on Mastodon these days. It's at jerry@infosec.exchange. I do hang out a little bit on LinkedIn. I am in the middle of trying to find a new job, and so I have had to go to the bad place. It's my name there is Malicious Link. So if you want to find me there, that's where you can get me. You can follow Andy online. It's at Lerg on X, and it's at Lerg. That's LERG on infosec.exchange. And I honestly don't know what his LinkedIn handle is. So with that, we will talk again real soon. I hope you have a great week. Take care.